Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Growth Leap. I'm your host, Michel Gagnon. We talk to pretty awesome business builders who are designing disruptive and meaningful companies. Happy New Year, everyone. We've got some great interviews for you in the pipeline this year, and we wanted to start strong. If you're interested in building a startup that works like clockwork, well, you need to listen to our guest today. He's done it, and he's done pretty much everything right. He co-founded Feedback Panda, a SaaS startup, and went from launch to selling it in just under 2 years. Arvid Kahl is an entrepreneur, investor, author, software engineer, and bootstrap startup expert. He's the author of the book Zero to Sold, How to Start, Run, and Sell a Bootstrapped Business, and he's busy writing a second book. We talk about what to do to build a sellable company, his approach to automation, how to stay in touch with end users, how we made build or buy decisions, his secret to onboarding employees quickly, and his take on founders, mental health, and bootstrapping. It was such a fun and insightful interview. I really hope you enjoy. Welcome to the show, Arvid. It's a pleasure having you with us. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Arvid, you co-founded Bootstrap and sold in just under 2 years feedbackpanda.com, an online teacher productivity SaaS company. Before we delve into that experience, because it's quite an interesting one, can you give us a quick rundown of your background and what you've been doing since you sold the business in 2019?
All right. Well, I'm a software engineer by trade, I think. That's what I learned to do. That's what I was first paid to do. And that's what I always considered myself to be. But usually people are much more than just one thing. And that's what I figured out when I started building businesses with people, friends and colleagues. Co-founded a couple of bootstrap businesses, worked for VC-funded businesses as a software engineering tech kind of person there, but turned out to be an entrepreneur as well. And then we founded and built Feedback Panda, like you said, me being my girlfriend and I. So it was a team effort, a relationship that was both private and business at the same time. Super interesting dynamics there, I can tell you that. And then after that, I started writing about it. Once we sold the business, once we exited and sold for what I'm allowed to say is a life-changing amount of money, we didn't have much to do, honestly, because once you give your company away, you run it full steam, and then all of a sudden there's nothing, right? You run into this void, this hole. And I filled that with writing about my experiences, both with Feedback Panda and all the bootstrap projects that I was part of before. A couple here in Berlin as well, where I'm located and where I've been located for a couple of years now. I'm German, so it's kind of logical for me to go to the most interesting German city where lots of startups happen. So that's where I am. That's what I am. And yeah, I've been writing books, writing articles, having a podcast, all these kind of things ever since we sold the business, which was mid-2019. So now over a year and a half, I've been releasing content, and I wrote a book called Zero to Sold, which has been doing really well in the bootstrapping, indie hacker, indie founder community, which I'm super proud of and super happy about. Yeah, that's what I've been doing.
Great. And let's go back a bit and talk about Feedback Panda. You basically grew the company from an idea to a business, generating 55,000 in monthly recurring revenue without hiring a single employee. And then you sold that to SureSwift Capital in less than 2 years. Can you just give us a bit of a brief on what Feedback Panda is or was for you?
Sure. Yeah, it still is. SureSwift Capital acquired the property and just continued to run it, which was one of the things we really wanted to happen, because we actually solved a problem that wasn't just there to make us money. It was a meaningful thing that we cared about. Like Feedback Panda is a result of Danielle, my girlfriend, working as an online English teacher and running into brick walls with one particular thing, and that was student feedback. Like she was working from home because she had a leg injury, couldn't go outside, couldn't do other things, so she needed to find some way to make money from home. She was teaching kids in China English as a second language over the internet through a browser, which is highly specific if you think about it. But knowing that is such a specific task, we could also really pinpoint the problems in that space. And those were problems that all these other teachers that these Chinese companies had hired, North American teachers, Canadians, people from the US or British people, anybody who speaks English natively, they would be hired as a contractor for these Chinese companies. So was Danielle, my girlfriend. And she was often teaching 8-10 hours a day. And then she had to do student feedback for an additional 2 hours, but that was unpaid. And if she didn't do it, she wouldn't be paid for the lessons she taught anyway. So it was this really annoying central problem that all these other teachers had as well. And Danielle, one point came to me and said, well, can we solve this? Then we looked into it together, and I built like a prototype, little SaaS, a little technical solution to her problem involving templating. And don't really need to go into the details, but it's a productivity tool. It takes these 2 hours of doing one task and condenses it into 5 minutes, which is significant because that's 2 more hours you can either spend with your kids if you're a teacher, or you can teach 2 more kids and make like $50 more a day, which is significant because most of those teachers, and that's what I kind of trying to hint at with we cared about this, most of these teachers were doing this as their second or third job. Like, this was a group of people that had a full-time job being a teacher. Yeah. And then in the morning, before they would go to school to teach, they would wake up at like 3 a.m. and teach for 2 hours online to make, I don't know, $100 a day so they could make ends meet. Mm-hmm. And that was the kind of community that these teachers were in. And that was the kind of financial situation that they were all experiencing. So building something for them that solved this problem and allowed them to actually have more time with their family and their loved ones, that was the mission of Feedback Panda. And that was why it was so well adopted by our customers, because they understood that wasn't just a company that was trying to make money off their problem. Like, we actually needed this for ourselves, because the first person to actually suffer this was Danielle. Like, she had to do these 2 hours every day. But the second person was I, because I didn't have my partner. Like, there she was sitting there after 10 hours of teaching, typing away for 2 hours. What's the point of that? So we solved our problem. We essentially scratched our own itch. And we knew, and I explained this earlier, this was such a specific niche community. We knew exactly that there was, at that point, like 7,000 other people who had the exact same problem. Mm-hmm. And if you know that everybody's doing the same job and they all have the same problem, well, then you can relate to them and you can give them this product as a solution to the problem, which we did. The first and kind of only marketing we only ever really did was a comment on a Facebook post in a Facebook group where all these teachers would hang out. That was the kind of water cooler. And Danielle posted, as a response to somebody asking, how do you deal with feedback? She said, well, I use Feedback Panda. I also made Feedback Panda, but I use it, right? And then people would try it out. We had like 80 signups on the first day, and we had a conversion rate of like 30-something, 40%, because it was just such a specifically tailored solution to this extremely common and equally felt problem in this community. Mm-hmm. And then word of mouth was our marketing strategy, essentially. Like, we put every single effort, piece of or kind of effort that we had into facilitating word of mouth communication, building a newsletter where we wouldn't only highlight our product, but we would also highlight one of the users of our product. We would often just take a random user from a database, send them an email and say, hey, you're cool. What's your story? Tell us about like how you came into online teaching. Send us a picture of you with your family and why are you doing this? Just answer a couple questions. And we put this front and center into every newsletter episode that we send out there, because it was more important to highlight people in the community than to push our product in there. Because if you have something that elevates the whole community, people will look at your product anyway. And we really cared about actually building community. I mean, we also cared about building a product, let's be honest here, and making money. But we knew that this teacher community was so tribal. It was such a tight-knit group of people that by facilitating building community, we knew we would never run out of customers. And we didn't. Like, we had a constant influx of people without having to do any kind of paid advertising, without having to do any like cold outreach. People did that for us. They referred our product before we even had a referral system in place, because it was just such a
nice problem to have.
Yeah, right. And then we actually increased our prices 1 year after we launched the product. And to make the deal a bit sweeter, we put in a referral system where people could kind of recoup the additional amount of money they would pay. And that did make a difference. People still and already shared so much that the referral system didn't make much of a dent. It just kind of allowed us to do like customer-driven onboarding, where customers allowed other customers to learn how to use the product, that kind of stuff. But in the end, the whole marketing, the approach that we had was highly word-of-mouth, tribal community-driven.
You've touched on quite a few interesting points here. You talked about basically you a lot of people make the mistake of building a product and try to find a problem afterwards. What you did is you knew you had a problem and you built a solution for yourself and your partner, which is a great way to start a business. And you knew that there were other people who had the same challenges. You also talked about getting traction. Is this something that you thought about? Did you have a business plan with a marketing strategy and say we could do this, we could have Facebook ads or these things, or you just, as you said, Danielle made the comment and poof, you got the initial traction and we said, well, maybe we're onto something.
Well, it's a kind of overnight success that is 10 years in the making kind of story, because I've been burned a couple times in the past trying to build businesses and failed to validate that there was an audience, failed to validate that it was a critical problem that we're solving, failed to validate that the solution to a validated problem was actually a good one, and then failed to validate that the product that we're building would actually implement that solution in a way that fits into the workflow of the people. There's so many potential points in the evolution of a product or a business where you really have to make sure that you're not doing absolutely everything wrong, just like figuring out, like removing on a certain degree. And we missed those marks a couple times in the past. So I have this kind of learned understanding of where you need to make sure to stop for a second and take a look around and make sure you're not going into the completely wrong direction there. So that was a couple learnings that I had from my own past experiences. And maybe as an aside, but important part, the 2 years before we started Feedback Panda, that would be 2015, around that time, I had a job in Hamburg in Germany. That is 2.5 hours by train from Berlin. Yep. And that was a half presence, half remote job. So I would spend 3 days a week commuting from Berlin to Hamburg, which means you essentially sit in an ICE, the German high-speed train, for 2.5 hours there and 2.5 hours back. And since we're talking about Germany, the cell reception between cities is non-existent, so you can't even go online or watch a video or anything like that. You kind of have to come in prepared. So I read a lot and I downloaded a lot of podcasts on the subject, the Indie Hackers podcast or Startups for the Rest of Us, those kind of indie specific founder podcasts. Honestly, if you ask me why I did that, no idea. I just found them interesting. There was something in me that just yelled, I really need to learn more about this. And I was listening to all these shows, like from the beginning, hundreds of episodes, because I had a lot of time, three times 5 hours a week. It's like 15 hours a week, filled it with a lot of podcasts, and I read a lot of books. And in these 2 years, I just learned a lot about the potential pitfalls of those businesses, like other people's problems, essentially, and where they had challenges. And I kind of internalized that to a certain degree. I read a couple books like Built to Sell by John Warlow, right? Building a business where you can remove yourself and it would still continue running. Like, those concepts were already in my mind. That 4-hour work week, like automating as much as you can and like passing delegating to other people. And the E-Myth by Michael E. Gerber, you're not just a technician, you're also a manager and you're also a visionary. If you have those frameworks, if you understand them, then decisions that you make, even if you never built a business before, you make them from a different perspective. So these 2 years were formative for me because I just got all this framework knowledge and then I had to apply it. I still had to build it, right? But at least I had this foundation of, okay, I've heard about this problem before and I've seen where people take this from here. So I might aim into the same direction. So that was super helpful. And I think that is what's important. It was important for me because if I hadn't done this, we probably would have failed on the feature prioritization level. Like, what do we build next? Or how do we communicate with people? Do we even communicate with our customers at all, right? If I wouldn't have understood that people really have a lot of feedback cycles in their first couple months, and that's important, that's essential to get the first couple things right, I probably wouldn't have integrated intercom into the product. And then maybe we would have never talked to our first couple of customers and never learned where they struggle. And, all these little things, it really helped to understand how other people did it timely, both at that point, right, where people that were on the same journey at the same point where they struggled, but also about people who were at that point a couple of years ago and where they are now and what they struggle with now. It's just learning as much as you can is a good start. You still have to actually act on it. But if I hadn't learned all these things, I probably would have failed much more and lost much more money along the way, and maybe would have lost motivation along the way. So my recommendation is always to read and listen before you start. Of course, you have to start, but there's a lot out there to learn from and about. And not listening to other people's stories is kind of closing your eyes and ears to the reality of what business might be.
What is very interesting is that you're an engineer turned entrepreneur turned writer. In many tech startups, at one point you get to that tension between tech and business. And the bigger you get, sometimes the bigger that tension is. You've talked about feature prioritization. What I've seen in my experience sometimes is that you end up at a certain point, sometimes earlier than later, where the engineering team or the engineer, in your case, becomes a bit loose touch with the business or the customer. I've talked to some startups a few weeks back where they were saying, well, I want to hire a product owner so that the engineer can just code, right? From your experience, with what you just said about feature prioritization and how you went along to build the product, what's your advice? What are your learnings as an engineer? What's the best way for an engineer to be able to do deep work, which is to build the right code without losing touch with, the end user?
Yeah, there's just two extremes, right? There's the extreme where there's this absolute disconnect between the engineering team and the customer service team and the product team and whoever, where it's extremely just silo kind of thing, where they don't hear from other people. They don't even hear from the other teams if you don't tell them, right? This is the one extreme. And the other extreme is where everybody does everything. And that is also bad, equally bad, I guess, because that's what you say. Deep work is impossible. And I felt this with Feedback Panda when you're both responsible for telling people that you're fixing the thing and you're fixing the thing at the same time. Right? Yeah. We had a couple of these situations where, there was a problem with login with Facebook because they changed their API or something. And then people start yelling at us. And like you said in the beginning, we never hired. And it's not necessarily a good thing, but it was just two people. And we automated everything as much as we could. So we didn't have to deal with what were in the end 5,000 customers constantly talking to us, but some would. And then one of us would have to talk to them, right? If they didn't find an answer to their problem in the knowledge base, we would need to talk to them. And the moment you talk to somebody, no matter what it is, you're pulled out of any kind of meaningful state for engineering. It's just that's how I work, at least. I have to focus. I have to tunnel vision, find the bug, fix it, and hit it, and then deploy and test, all these things. And if you cannot do this because there's this intercom bubble on both the side of your browser and in your mind where people are telling you it doesn't work. Yeah, I know. I'm working over here. And if you don't have anybody to do this for you, then you can't really fix the problem. And you can also not tell people I'm going to fix it, because by telling them you're going to fix it, you can't fix it because it's just a conflict of operational capacity. So what I found, what we did, even without having anybody that would do this for us, finding this kind of first level of automation where people's conversations wouldn't immediately come through, but people would try to talk to, a chatbot or an automated system that would try to figure out what the actual problem is. And you could commandeer these systems. Intercom has these kind of bots, these automated response things, where if they have a trigger keyword, you can send them a message and it doesn't go through to the agent. So if people say it's down, you take this as a little message and you say, I know it's down. I'm working on it. I'll tell you once it's back. And you just protect yourself from this initial onslaught of information. So I think, like I'm saying, two extremes: extreme silo, extreme everything at the same time. You have to find some spot in between where the initial load of customer interaction is kind of
filtered.
Somebody needs to take all of this, the brunt of these things, and respond to them with either we are taking care of this, or here is how you can solve it if it's an easy thing to solve. And only the specifically complicated things should ever reach the engineering team. So that's what I would have loved to have with a person. We tried to automate it, and once we sold the business, they immediately hired a customer service person to take this load off the engineer that we also hired. Because essentially, if you are a solopreneur or in a really small team, then you're everything at the same time, and you can only time box so much, because the reality of customer service interactions is that they're random. So you have to figure out a way to protect yourself in this deep work state from these initial things. And if you can, hire somebody part-time who does 4 hours of customer service, where that in those 4 hours, everything goes to them. If that is what you need, right? If you need 4 hours of focus time every day, then do that. There's small steps. And that's what I forgot. to do when we built the business is that you can actually hire people part-time. I thought, hey, if we hire a customer service person, there better be enough work for a full-time customer service person. And the same with engineering, right? I always had to do little things, but it was never really worth a full-time position. And my mistake was to think, well, not going to hire an engineer until there's work for two, which is pointless because as a founder, you do anything anyway, right? You throw like 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours a day at a problem because you're the only one who can solve it. And it doesn't feel like this should be done by two people. So be realistic about what time you need, deep work time you need, and find somebody or something, AI, whatever you have, to protect you, to shield you from this for a bit. Like most things can wait. And that probably is also important to understand that even if a customer is reaching out to you, doesn't necessarily mean that you need to immediately look at it, right? You might, and having somebody pre-filter this for you is important or a useful thing, but most things can actually wait. So it's also a mindset thing.
I want to go back a bit later to hiring, but just before that, in an Indie Hacker podcast interview, I believe it was last year, you mentioned that what is key to build a bootstrap and sellable company is to make you, the founder, let's say the least important person, at least that you can remove yourself from the business. And you said you've accomplished that with Feedback Panda by setting automations and optimizations, which you touched on a bit earlier. If we dig deeper, what kind of automations or optimizations did you put in place to actually reach that goal?
Yeah, so I'm not trying to do any advertising for Intercom here today. There's probably a lot of really good alternatives that work just as well. But one thing that they had, and I think this is now like standard in the industry, so I guess it's okay for me to talk about this in an Intercom-like product, was an integration between their chat product and the knowledge base product, right? Once your customer, like, I don't know how to edit a student, then their system would figure out, okay, there's an article called How to Edit Your Student, might as well suggest that. And then people would solve their own problem. And that's like the self-service kind of customer service, which if you're just two people, you need that, right? You can have synchronous communication where you chat with people or asynchronous where you email back and forth. That's fine, but you need self-serve at a certain scale. It's just not possible to build a bootstrap solo or small team funded business with people who consistently ask you questions that you always respond to in the same way. In the end, Feedback Panda itself was a templating tool, right? So why would I not to take this, I write it once and use it multiple times approach in our customer service? So that's what we did. Whenever somebody asked us a question that we didn't have a written response to, we would answer the question in the chat, guide them through the thing, and then immediately write an article on this particular issue and put it in the knowledge base. So when somebody else would ask the same question, it would be automatically responded to as an option. They would click on it. It would have screenshots, maybe a little video of the walkthrough that I did, or Danielle did. And then their problem would in most cases be solved automatically, forever, immediately, right? It's like that is saving you a lot of time in the future. And we did this every time something new came up, which meant that after a couple months, our knowledge base had like 192 articles just on how do I edit a student, how do I delete a student, how do I edit a template, how to create a new template, how do I import a template, all these things that people would consistently wonder about when they started in their onboarding journey or at some later point when they were in a weird situation, we would have an answer to. And that freed up our time almost completely. I said earlier that we always had a couple of customer service conversations in a day, but even with 5,000 customers, that it would not exceed 10 to 15 per day conversations. But I can handle that. That's like one conversation an hour. There's still some space in between to do some work, right? And that is mostly due to this particular automation. Taking the questions that people have, turning it into an article with many kinds of media. Some people need video, some people need screenshots, some people need text, for all three, because might just as well, it's an investment into your future and your future time that you save. So give it some time at that moment. And then people would usually solve their own problems. We also, and I kind of talked about this earlier, had this automated response mechanism to certain keywords, right? There were certain problems that happen in customer service that need an immediate response, even though they don't need an immediate human interaction. Stuff like, I can't log in. That's just something where if you don't help them right then at that point, they get mad, right? Because
you lose them.
You lose them both as a customer and as a person who would actually talk well about your business in their community. And that's what we wanted, right? We didn't want people going out there yelling, feedback panel, I can't log in. They don't even respond to my comments or to my questions. That is bad. And that's bad PR in a tribal community. It gets amplified. Anything in a tribal community gets amplified, the good and the bad. So we made sure that for those people, we had an automated response that would capture most of the cases that would likely be the reason for this. We had login with Facebook, login with Google, and login with email. Usually, people would try to log in with one of the three, but their actual account was another one, like they were actually signed up with Facebook, but tried to log in with Google. Minor problem. We eventually built like a merging tool where we could like put the multiple account login methods into one. But the initial response you give, it seems like you might be using the wrong login provider. Log out and try the other one. And that would solve like 95% of the login problems. Right. And that is something that if you respond to can't log in as a string in Intercom, that solves all these immediately critical yet easily answered problems. So by finding those things and building the proper automations, communication automations, we built a system that was very resilient, because even when there was a problem with something, we could quickly put a message out there that would be automated as a reply, and then we could deal with fixing this as the two people that we were, or me as the one engineer in the company. It also led to some stress levels, and we can also talk about like anxiety, burnout, and stress, because if you're just two people and you're responsible for 5,000, and the business that you have, as well as it's doing, is your only real asset, it can be quite stressful. So in that situation, I should have hired more, but we can talk about that later. So that is the automation part on the customer service side. And then on the engineering side, any kind of deployment, any kind of building the Docker containers in which our software ran. And we had a Kubernetes system on the Google Cloud where it's a self-healing kind of system. Anything that I could automate away, I would. We used a database as a service provider, so we didn't run our own database. We used IBM has acquired, I think they were usually initially called Mongo HQ, but now called Compose. It's a service that just offers you a Postgres database or MongoDB database with like full DevOps support on there. And so it always runs. And if it breaks, then they fix it quickly. That was at some point before we sold, or when we sold that was the biggest thing that we paid for. I think we in the end ended up paying $4,000 for that monthly, which is hefty, but it's almost the same as actually hiring somebody that would do it in-house, with the exception that that person only works 8 hours a day, but the people at Compose work 24, right? And there's a whole army of engineers who could jump at a problem. So anything that was not my expertise, and I'm a software engineer that works well with backend and front-end stuff, but I'm not that good with administrative or like DevOps kind of activities, we would outsource in a sense that we would have an automated system or a company that would deal with that specifically, deal with that for us. And those two things, they really made a big difference.
And this is the last point is very interesting because, when you have engineers, you can ask them, could we do this? Could we build this? And the answer is usually, well, technically everything's possible, right? And depending on the team or depending on yourself, the individual, you will jump on it and, start building, or you will, like you, decide to outsource. Is this a question of personality where you said, well, I don't want to get into this too complicated? Or you made a conscious decision when you prioritize, what is it? What's my core, let's say, product? What's my core value proposition and where my core competency, let's call it that way. And what is it that, I should outsource?
It's almost like the feature prioritization thing we talked about earlier, just on a higher abstraction, right? It's like what parts of the system that I'm building, and the system here is not just the software, but the business, right? It's the infrastructure of the business. Mm-hmm. What parts of that am I comfortable with? What parts of that are critical? And the thing is, many people consider critical things to be the things that need to be in-house. I do not necessarily agree with that. Like if you have your own servers and you maintain your own servers because only you can be responsible for these things, that is an argument that I sometimes hear and I don't agree with. I would rather trust a platform like AWS or the Google Cloud or Heroku for that matter, which my new SaaS that I'm currently building is running on. I would trust them with that because as much as there's platform risk there, at least I know that their business is to keep my business running. right?
Yeah, yeah.
My business, the purpose of my business is to serve my customers. It's not to maintain an infrastructure product, right? Servers are a necessity. They're not the core function of my business. I need servers to be able to build a SaaS, but I don't want to maintain them. So that would be like the measuring stick to which I would put any kind of service. And the same thing goes for authentication and for payment and for invoice stuff, right? These little things that are so hilariously complicated and boring. Gotta say, invoices, most boring subject on earth, that I would always try to find somebody who reliably can solve this for me and integrate them, even at the risk that their business might explode or they may have downtime at some point. And we had that. We used Auth0, the service for logins and authentication, and they had an issue at one point. And for 1 hour, you couldn't log in using the login with Facebook little button. And it sucked. We had to own that. We had to tell our customers, sorry for that. Sorry you can't log in right now. It's a problem with one of the services that we use, but we take full responsibility because as much as it's their fault, we use them. We chose them, right? So we kind of had to own that. But that was 1 hour in 2 years. If I had built my own little login with Facebook's software kind of thing, that would probably have been more times in 2 years. And then I wouldn't have anybody working on fixing that. I would have to do that. And we had this. Like, I would have to tell people I'm fixing it and then fix it. And it's complicated. Like, anything involving other services out there, it's a risk, right? Nothing is up 100%. So there's always these little error modes in between. And for payment, we used Stripe because we knew they would deal with payments. They would deal with credit cards not working. They would deal with fraud detection. I don't want to do that, right? Like, why would I ever build a payment system myself? It's nice to have people's credit card information, but is it really? Like, are you GDPR compliant? Are you PCI compliant? Like, all these little things. The moment you outsource that to companies who are, you're rid of that responsibility too. And honestly, talking from a legal perspective, if you can say that your business is GDPR compliant, it's PCI, it's HIPAA compliant, if you do medical stuff, or, all these little kind of compliance things, if you can say we are compliant because the vendors that we use, they have to be compliant, and they are, and here are the certificates, that's just less of a threat, right? Nobody will attack your business if they know that your data is secured with a big, compliant, secure provider. But if they know that you have a database somewhere where there's usernames and passwords and credit cards, you become a target. And what I wanted to be a founder, didn't want to be a target. So I took all these things and let other people solve them for me. The only things that we had in-house was our, we call it intellectual property, right? The secrets to how we did this templating and how we built a little template sharing system. And we had a machine learning system in the background for template pronoun translation. Too complicated, but we had some stuff that we needed in-house, but all these other things that are not business critical, we outsourced as much as we could.
Pretty smart approach to focus on the core things. Let's talk about hiring. You talked about the fact that maybe it was a mistake for you not hiring earlier. Can you tell us a bit why? You kind of mentioned there was not enough work for one person, but was there any other reasons why you did not hire?
I've actually had this conversation on Twitter a couple of days ago, and I remember what I said. So I'm just going to quote myself here. As an engineer, I was trained my whole life to be hired. Really. Like, I'm a technical specialist. I can solve problems. I'm hired to build solutions, and I'm trained to build solutions. So everything I see is a potential solution, which is the other problem, which is why most technical founders don't start with an audience and their problem and their solution, but they start with the idea, and then they try to backpedal. Is this solving a problem? So for whom? Maybe is it? Maybe, like that whole problem. But that's the other side. The hiring part is I was never trained to do anything meaningful in terms of leadership in a team, because people just really took me, put me in a seat and said, here's your screen, here's your keyboard, solve this problem for me. Which is probably also my fault because I didn't grow beyond that, maybe. But I was never trained to hire. I was always just trained to be hired. And I think many engineers, many people from a technical background, but maybe also from like a marketing or from a design background, they have the same problem, right? They don't go through this managerial approach. And that's what I said earlier with Michael E. Gerber's The E-Myth, the book, right? That talks about this. And I read it and I still messed it up, right? It's this kind of situation where I didn't understand, even though I was in teams before, that I could have that too. It's just like everything you do when you found a business for the first time, you build a business for the first time, everything is new. Like talking to customers is new because all of a sudden it's not just you as an engineer doing your job. It's you trying to build something that has never existed before, right? A whole business, a whole entity, a whole thing. And they're feeling overwhelmed becomes a normal thing in a business like that. And learning to do new things every single day is also normal. Financials, reporting, taxes, never done this before. And all of a sudden you have to report huge sums of money. At least we did that in the end to an agency that is really specific. And, Germany and tax agencies, they're really like looking into stuff. And now you need to do this right, even though you've never done this before. Nobody told you how to do it. The people out there who could tell you how to do it are super expensive. It's just every day is a new challenge. And in that situation, hiring just didn't feel that important to me because there was all these other things around that I needed to deal with. And that was the worst part. I could actually deal with these things, like if there was an engineering problem, maybe I couldn't solve it today, but I would solve it tomorrow. And if there was a business problem or an infrastructure problem, I would kind of figure out a way. And there was never really a hard ceiling that I hit. I could always stretch myself further and increase my anxiety levels and my mental health destabilization levels. But I could always go further. And I didn't have anybody tell me, why don't you just hire somebody? I mean, Danielle told me that. And she was the CEO of the business, and she saw that. But she couldn't really convince me that it was me that I was standing in my own way. I felt like, no, I can deal with this. I can do it. Let's just try to do it this way. And she said, sure, you are the tech guy. You know best, right? I thought I did, but I didn't. I should have listened to her much, much earlier and hired. So it is my personal, I wouldn't call it incompetence, but not being able to recognize when I'm stretched too far. That was because you have this community of founders that is super helpful and super nice, but there's still a lot of glorification of hustling at all times, right? Everybody hustles, and hustling is nice. Doing stuff, getting places is great. It will actually improve your life, but you can do too much, right?
Yes.
You can go too far. You can neglect yourself, your family, your loved ones, your mental health. And that part was something I was not aware of. And honestly, the reason that I started writing once we sold the business was because I was on the verge of a mental breakdown. Like there was one thing that I wrote during all of Feedback Panda that was the only thing that I had time to write because 24/7 dealing with customers, engineering, and doing marketing as much as it was like writing and all these things. I didn't have time for myself. But at some point, I was so broken by this whole stressful situation that I just had to write a blog post on how I'm dealing with my mental health problems while I was still running the business. I never released that. But in writing that post, it was clear to me that I needed a valve for this, like to just let it out. So that triggered a list of blog posts that I was gonna write the moment we sold. I made lists, we as engineers, we plan and we have to-dos and stuff. So I made this gigantic list of blog posts that I wanted to write in the future. And I think the first 25 of them were all about the emotional journey of bootstrapping, the roller coaster of that, and how I would deal with imposter syndrome, how I would deal with being overcome with even grief for selling the product. And, all these little things, they were so present on my mind. And that is something that we don't really talk about much in the community because we talk about success, we talk about MRR, great, right? We talk about sales, exits, and failure, but we don't really talk about this constant droning of stress in the actual real evolution of a business. And that's where I started. I've gone more into the actual pragmatic parts of building a business well than into complaining about mental problems, but I still sometimes touch upon that. But I feel it's the thing that we don't talk enough about, and that's why I'm bringing it up right here. Because every founder that I talk to eventually comes to a point where it gets slightly too much, and that's already too far. I think they should already consider their life, the lifestyle, and how they run their business before. And I think that's where like I said, automation and well-documented system is a system that other people can run for you, which is the whole point of the build to sell approach, right? A sellable business is this business that runs without you, because then you could sell it and it would still run for the other person. It's the whole point of the book in a sentence, right? Build a business where you can take yourself out, put somebody else in, and it's still doing the exact same amount of money, maybe even more. Then you have a good and sellable business. And if you look at every business decision that you make from that perspective, like how can I remove myself more from this business without it becoming worse, then I think you have a pretty clear North Star on how to stay sane while doing it. Because you can work yourself to death, like literally with this, right? You can become so weak that you have a heart attack, or I guess now you become more susceptible to the virus or whatever is out there that's gonna get you, right? You just really need to stay healthy and mentally capable to deal with the business. And the easiest way of doing this, in my opinion, right, there's other people who think differently, is by removing yourself from the operational part of the business, going more into the ownership role and into the leadership role, and having people take over, which is what hiring is, which makes this hilariously ironic that I'm telling you that. And I, during running the business up to the very end, considered this to be the wrong approach. Only once we sold did we actually start hiring, right? When SureSwift took over, we were responsible for finding our replacement. And our replacement were essentially, for me, it was an engineer and a customer service person. And for Danielle, it was, a business owner, product manager kind of situation. So each of us hired like 2 people to replace themselves. And once I did that with the chief of, or the VP of engineering of SureSwift, we did that together because he wanted to make sure that people fit into his business. I needed to make sure that they fit into Feedback Panda. Once we did that, it was such an enjoyable experience. It's like, I thought, it's going to be super complicated and I don't know how to talk to people. And then we just had a talk like we're having now. And we talked about tech, and we talked about like Elixir and Phoenix, like the language and framework that I used for Feedback Panda, and Vue.js and all this technology and like startups and bootstrapping. It was such a nice experience. And I kind of face palmed extensively at that point, because it's like, why didn't I do this sooner? This is so enjoyable. This is so nice. And these people, they actually are driven. They want to help the same people. They want to help teachers. They want to help them make more money and have more time with their family. Why didn't I see this? So I guess finding somebody who can tell you, mentor you into this would be important. In retrospect, that's what I would have loved to have, like a mentor who could tell me, okay, now hire somebody, right? Why? Well, because of this. That would have been great. But if you don't have that, just consider how your time is valuable and somebody else's time might be better spent on this, because they might actually enjoy it even more than you do. Like customer service, I liked it, never loved it. Some people love customer service. Honestly, even if they get yelled at by people, they just love it. They just need to help. Why not hire them? They might be much better than you are, right? So it's like all about like putting yourself into a perspective where you're not the most important thing. Like where your ego is not bound to the company. The company is something. You as an owner have one role. You as a leader of the business have another role, and you as a technician have a third role. And that's kind of hard because it's kind of schizophrenic, because the decisions you make as an owner for a business might be diametrically opposed to the technology decisions that you make, or even the CEO level decisions that you make. But you have to make sure that you're not just one of these and the other two come crashing down upon you at some point because you ignored them for too long.
I think also, you talked about the glorification of hustling. I totally agree with that. And I think sometimes hustling becomes a synonym of lack of structure and lack of productivity, right? It's kind of, instead of slowing down to go faster, you just do whatever comes to mind, right? You're too much in the weeds. Another thing that also happens when you hire is that it takes time, right? It's not like you hire somebody and that person is up to speed and everything's fine, in a week or two. So I think sometimes also founders think about, oh my God, hiring is another thing on the top of your to-do list, and it requires effort and coaching.
Funny enough, if I may interject here, sorry about that, but our tech replacement for me, it literally took them a week to get up to speed, because I've been documenting extensively, knowing that at some point, that's the almost contradictory nature of this. I didn't want to hire, but I built a piece of software that was manageable by a team, because that's how I was trained to build software, right? I did code, like nice commit messages in the repository and comments in the code wherever something might be unclear. So the whole code base was well documented. And I even did an 11-hour video walkthrough through the code base where I just really scrolled through the code base and explained every single piece of code for my replacement. Like, took me a day, but once that was there, they could literally listen to this for a whole day or two, and then they would know exactly everything about the code base and how the software is working, right? So by having good documentation, that's like the flip side of good automation is good documentation, because if you have SOPs that are essentially documentation in an actionable format, you can hand those over and somebody else can look at them and say, okay, if somebody asks this question, I respond with that. And then I do these things. It clearly laid out, right? There's no guesswork there. And if you have documentation in your code, an engineer goes in there and say, oh, okay, yeah, that's the problem. And then they go to the point of reference and the things are named well, they understand it well, that they might check out the video where I explain exactly how this is supposed to work. And then that's fine. And that's why it actually didn't take our replacements that long, because we had it all. And that's the funny part. I could literally have hired somebody who within a week could have done my job. And I didn't. Like, of course, what you're saying, there are certain situations where somebody takes longer. I would guess with a product manager or with somebody who really needs deep insight, not just into the product, but also into the audience, into the customer base, into the market itself that they may not be part of. That can be a teaching kind of period where you have to divide your attention between dealing with the business, maybe even dealing with business adjacent things like a sale, and dealing with teaching this person at the same time. So that's a lot on the plate. And that's also one of the reasons why I didn't do it, because I feared that it would take that long. Had I known that it was just going to be a week and then they would be super autonomous, would have done it much earlier.
So you recorded basically.
Yeah.
When you talk about documentation, you didn't build like 20 pages or 20-page PDFs, right? You recorded.
No, I actually recorded a video. We had a lot of different shapes of documentation. We had SOPs for customer service interaction and for things like deployment and release stuff. Like we had a browser extension and a desktop application that people would install and use with their teaching portal for integration reasons. And those needed to be, it was quite complicated to deploy a browser extension, to deploy a piece of installable software. Not that easy, but we had step-by-steps. So I put like little Google Doc or something with step-by-step screenshots and stuff. So that was there. Then there were the SOPs, which were also a 50-page Google Doc with like, if a person can't log into their account and they tried everything, here's how to restore it. Go to the admin dashboard, click here and enter the name. And these kind of things. That was all in the document kind of shape, shareable document, and like Google Doc kind of situation. And then we had like mission statement, company vision, and the history of the company, how we made certain decisions, like why we chose Stripe over Chargebee or why we chose Google over AWS. You can probably tell I'm German. I do like documentation and I do like to write things down, but that helped a lot. Because those documents, once we handed them over during, even just a couple of those documents we could hand over during the initial conversations with Swift Capital, that made the deal so much sweeter for them. Because they knew, okay, there's more of this, right? That we can literally take this, give this to an engineer, and they don't need to talk to the founders at all. It's all here. Awesome. So it was a win-win situation. Let's just call it that. And that makes the company extremely sellable. The automation is great. But people who buy a company, they might have the funds to hire a couple people. So you don't necessarily need all of that automation at all times when you sell. But having documentation that is extensive and thorough, now that is important. Because that's usually where the dip happens, right? You sell your business and the business is doing well, and then they have to acclimatize, and then it just dips for a bit before they find their way and deal with their business the way it should be done. But we didn't have a dip. Like it just went straight up from when we sold because we had everything in place. And that makes it very interesting for an acquirer.
Yeah. And just also for the people listening to us, it's something that you've built that documentation over time, right?
Yeah.
So it's not,
something. Yeah. I would document it. Just like when people asked me to do something or asked me why something wouldn't work and I would tell them how to do it, when I would implement a new mechanism to deploy my Docker containers to Kubernetes, I would take the command I used in the terminal, copy it, put it into the document where the SOP was, and modify the steps we had before, just keep it current. Because I knew that if I do this, like let's say you deploy something like an auxiliary service, you deploy it once every couple months, you forget. You literally forget how you logged into your server. And I know that if something breaks, you need to be there quickly. And if you have to figure out how you did something 6 years or 6 months ago, well, this is going to take time. So whenever you do something that you only do once, I just take the command I used, put it into a document, and I put what I did there to hopefully in the future know exactly how to get back there and how to quickly do it. So I trained myself to document new things as I was doing them to have reliable thing that I could execute later. Right? I could just go step by step by step and have a reliable result. Not just me, but everybody who would do it.
I don't want to take too much of your time, but there's something else I want to talk about is, we've talked about hustling being glorified these days, but there are other things that are being glorified. We live in a world where startups who are successfully raising a new round of funding are celebrated a bit like pop stars or Nobel Prize winners. You wrote that, and I quote, "Bootstrapping is a desirable, value and wealth generating way of running a company, and still many people shy away from it." That's a bit contrarian to what we're saying at the moment in the startup scene around the world. Can you tell us a bit about that? Elaborate.
Yeah, well, first, the first thing to understand is that all kinds of funding are fine. I just want to lay out the foundation here. If you need VC capital, if you have an idea that only works if you capture the whole market and build the biggest thing, perfect. Go for VC. Go for funding like that. Perfectly fine. But you don't need that amount of money to build a sustainable business. And often enough, the unicorns, they're not sustainable. And if you look at recent IPOs and the businesses that didn't make it there, they just really grew and imploded, right? Or almost imploded and then still IPO'd for some reason. So no judgment there, but there's this whole thing where the hockey stick is glorified, but the sustainable linear curve is not, right? And the hockey stick only works because there's more money being thrown into the system to just amplify growth and just hyper growth to fuel that. To what end? I don't know. But the thing is, only a couple of those companies can succeed. That's the whole point of venture capital. That's baked into the mathematics, right? 1 out of 10 might succeed. 1 out of 100 will succeed. Like if you are one of those 99 or 9 or whatever in between, well, then you're out of luck. Then you just failed and you have to do something else. I believe that if we look at sustainable businesses, like what Feedback Panda was, but like what many other bootstrap businesses are, all of them succeed. Like, of course, not everybody who starts a bootstrap business succeeds at building a business, but if you build a business that creates a sustainable stream of revenue and grows sustainably, that is success too. It doesn't have to explode. It doesn't have to become like 10x year over year. That is not what success means to me. Success means like you make $10,000 a month with your SaaS or your info product or your course or whatever, and you can feed yourself, feed your family, pay the mortgage, pay the car loan, and your life is there. That is the lifestyle you can live. Like it's literally the lifestyle business approach, right? Which many people laugh at because it sounds like, it's like Instagram kind of self-promoting lifestyle, but it's really not. It's more about building something that can sustain your life that you have full control over. And there's no dilution, right? If you are in a bootstrap business, you own your business. And I mean, there are now options for funding that are actually aligned with goals for bootstrappers. Earnest Capital is one of those, right? The thing that Tyler Tringus, who also sold his business to Joseph Capital, by the way, just made happen. It's a funding source, and I'm an investor there. So just so you know, that is aligned with bootstrappers.
Is it like revenue-based financing?
Yeah, it's revenue-based. It's like shared earnings agreement is the thing, I think, what they call it. Okay. And the idea is that if all of these businesses get funding and grow, and they slowly grow, then in the end, we'll all benefit, right? Because if you have 10 businesses in a batch and 10 businesses succeed, even if they don't explode, they don't need to, because they all grow and they all produce profits for themselves and for the investors and for essentially the families that are surrounded or that surround the founders and for the local businesses around them. I think it's an interesting and equally valid way of approaching business, right? You don't have to want to become the next Microsoft or Google. You can just be the next, I don't know, even Basecamp is a great example, right? If that is the North Star, a calm business, a slow growing but profitable business with like, what do they have, 50 people or something? And they are the stars in the community because they've understood that you can build a business without burning out. And you can build a business without like doing shady marketing tricks, without like tricking people into buying your product. You can just be honest with your customers. And that is perfectly fine too. So that's why I advocate bootstrapping. Again, you don't have to bootstrap your business, but it's just as well an option as VC funding or getting loans or whatever there is out there. Right? There's many different ways of funding a business, but bootstrapping is fine. And of course, there are prerequisites to that, right? Either you find something like Earnest Capital or tiny seed accelerators that go for bootstrap businesses and help them a little bit and have a mentor network around them where people can learn something from people who've done this before. Or you put your personal money in there, which is risky, but it's also an option. It's like self-funded business. But in the end, what you want to accomplish is being a customer-funded business. And that it's funny that this is a novel term, right?
It's such a good term, though.
Any business should be customer-funded, but some are not. And that's where VC comes in, right? They are not necessarily customer-funded. They are investor-funded, hoping that through valuation explosion, the investors cash out at some point, and then the business is stable enough to sustain itself. But for bootstrap businesses, it's the other way around. You have complete ownership over the destiny of your business. You grow it at any speed you want, and you stay in your niche. That's also a thing. We haven't really talked about this. I alluded to it with Feedback Panda because the niche that we served was so specific. But if that is the niche that we served and we could build a six-figure business, right? We made like at the end $600,000 a year in ARR with that business. Well, then go into the next niche and build that for them. Build whatever they need the most for them. And our customer really was online English as a second language teacher from North America teaching to Chinese children over the internet through a web browser. It's like 7 filters over the global audience, 7 nested niches in one. Just go to the next one. Online biology or online music teachers teaching kids from all over the world how to play music. Build something for them. Or go back, just online teachers. And that you can really find a niche anywhere. And in those niches is a lot of potential. Some are already full. Some are completely unexplored. There's still some kind of work you have to do to find your audience. And that's funny enough. The next book that I'm writing.
Yeah. But you're stealing my questions. That was perfect. Perfect segue. Keep going. So your next book is Audience First, right?
That's right, because in writing Zero to Sold, I figured out you start with an audience to detect a critical problem, you find your solution that fits into the workflow, and then you build a product that works in the medium that they're used to. That's like the condensed version of the first 250 pages. That the audience is the most important part. An audience here is not just like Twitter audience or like people who listen to you or something. It's really the group of people you want to empower. Some call it market, some call it potential prospective customers or a total addressable market, all these phrases. But to me, it's the audience, because at some point they will be listening to you, or at least they should be listening to you at some point, right? So that's what it is to me. And finding the people you want to serve, the people you want to help, the people you want to lift up, that's the critical moment in your entrepreneurial journey. Because we found that in online English teachers because we knew how desperate they were for help. Like here was this group of people, thousands of teachers, and they had to use Excel sheets and Word documents to just being able to cope with this. And whenever somebody has to use Excel, I want to help them because they shouldn't have to, And at that moment, we just knew this group of people is in dire need. They exist. This group of people is there. There is like this group of 7,000 people in this one Facebook group already that all are doing the same job. They're validated. They're out there and they are hungry for a solution to what? Well, here's the critical problem. We found it because we experienced it ourselves. And being able to find this problem requires you to know who you're serving. Right? If you go audience, problem, solution, product, you cannot build the product without knowing which solution you're doing. You don't know which solution you're building without knowing which problem you're solving, and you can't know which problem you're solving without knowing who you're solving it for. So that's where you start, and that's what I'm currently working on to give like a more structured approach to finding the audience that works best for you, which could be anything, could be somebody, some kind of group of people that you're already part of, but also some group of people that you don't even know you're part of just yet. Like there's a lot in reflection and actually going out there and embedding yourself in communities to see if that is the community that you want to empower and help. But that's what I'm working on right now. And that's what I feel is the most important part in the whole entrepreneurial journey. One that's often skipped because, like we said earlier, most technical founders are solution driven. So they see problems out there, so they immediately jump to the product. I'm going to build Tinder for cats. I'm going to build like Facebook for plumbers, or like product vision. And then they have the idea, and then they try to backpedal into the audience, which is often hard because Tinder for cats, like it's a stupid idea because it's supposed to be. But I mean, delivery service for cats, that might be a good one, or is it not? You don't know because you don't solve a critical problem. You solve a problem, maybe, but you don't know if it's critical or not.
So Audience First is in progress. When should we expect that to be available for the public? Just to put a bit of pressure.
The fun part about Audience First is that it's itself an Audience First product. So I've started collecting, I guess, an email list of people who are my alpha draft readers. So I want to put a book out there that I'm actually building with the audience that I'm writing it for. So right now I have like a couple hundred people on that email list, and the draft it's getting somewhere, but I would say I'm probably not going to finish it this year. So somewhere around January, February is going to be the time when the first draft is going out. And then I'm going to do a lot of feedback cycles with this audience to make sure that this book actually solves their problem, because there would be a stupid mistake to make to write a book without actually involving the people. Like it's just a meta project. It's an audience first book about audience first. And yeah, at some point next year, it's going to be out. I've been very heavily inspired by Rob Fitzpatrick, the guy who wrote the book, The Mom Test, which is one of the most important books for anybody who does customer exploration, just calls with customers for validation or verification reasons. He wrote a new book, Write Useful Books is the title. He just released it a week or two ago. And his experience in writing really, really good nonfiction books has now caused him to write a book about how to write good nonfiction books. And that has been super helpful. He's been extremely actively engaging in customer feedback cycles, and I'm approaching it his way at this point as well. So if you're writing a book, anybody out there, check out Rob Fitzpatrick's latest. It's really, really useful because he explains how his Mom Test book came to be and how he finessed it into what it eventually turned out to be. And the other book that he wrote in between about workshops as well. It's really, really insightful. So I'm trying to make this a public thing. I'm building in public, not just a SaaS, which I'm also building. I'm building a SaaS for authors called Permanent Link, for people who have like links in their books and they don't want them to start failing when the original websites go down. So I'm building a solution to help people have control over the links in their books, which is important because I'm solving my own problem here. I have a book with links. I need to put links in a book that I have control over. So I'm building a SaaS to solve this problem. That's the kind of the entrepreneurial journey. Like you find something, you do something, you find something in there that doesn't work. Then once you're done doing the thing, you now fix the little thing in there and it becomes a new thing with a little problem in there. And it's just like this Russian doll situation where you just layers upon layers of little problem solving exercises. But yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. I'm super excited because it's awesome to work with the bootstrapping community on this. Because people have asked me to put certain things in the book because I asked them to tell me what they want to read about, things I would never have thought of, and things that are extremely challenging to deal with. So it's awesome for me to be able to do the research and put that into like one cohesive unit.
Great. Well, we're really looking forward to be able to read this. Where is the best place for our audience to follow you, Arvid?
Easiest thing is Twitter, because I'm on Twitter 12 hours a day, apparently. You can find me on Twitter at Arvid Kahl, ARVIDKAHL. And yeah, I guess the Bootstrap Founder is my blog, and I have a podcast there and links to the book and everything. So thebootstrapfounder.com, those two places.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. You're extremely passionate and generous with your time. I think we could have gone like this for another hour or two, but thanks for joining us on the show. And hopefully we'll be able to meet face-to-face when the world comes back to normal.
Absolute pleasure. It was really nice. And I do hope that. I mean, that the whole pandemic has been really tough on everybody. Mm-hmm. And it would be really nice to be able to connect physically in the same location with founders again. So I'll take you up on that when well vaccinated and happy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. And as usual, you can find the show notes at stunena.com. Also, if you want to accelerate your startup growth and build something meaningful, well, check out our Growth Lead for Tech Startups online course at growth.stunena.com. Thanks a lot.